Let's go back, sorry about that. Which we said in the physical world is gravity, in the world of Asya. But the key to understand that this expression of gravity in the physical world is a relationship of love in the superior dimensions. Love is the force that attracts us to an individual, to an object, to an environment, to a color. That sense of attraction is actually the divine, the spiritual force, the electromagnetic field that draws us towards something. There is nothing that is inherently, again, evil or bad. It's that we get attached to it, or we attach to that thing. Just like God is not good, like this particular book or this particular symbol doesn't necessarily make it religious. It's the attraction that we have for it. That is the element that is actually the divine. And whether it's something that we're attracted to or repelled by, or some negative thing that we're attracted to, the key to understand is to not be identified, to not identify so that my awareness becomes entangled with the object, so that I forget myself. The simple relationship would be forgetting that my attention is divided into 3 parts. And whenever I notice that, return back. Because the relationship or the polarity of the force, the electromagnetic force, where my attention is, and the key is the proper proportion or perspective or space between my sensations, between the objects, between situations, because that produces an electric charge. Well, it didn't happen, it didn't do it again. That's funny. I did it, and now it won't. But there's something wrong somewhere. Okay, forget it. But produces a charge that goes either up or down relative to the polarization of my attention. And that's why gratitude and prayer are so helpful. And now, I said this to somebody today, that I was talking about my office, and we were talking about, because we're doing some construction, and that my office isn't just my office, it's where I work, it's where I relax, it's where I pray, it's where I meditate. And I know that's not maybe the optimal situation for everybody, but it's the way that I operate. It's my space for that. And I realize that when I say pray, what that means to some people, it's a certain idea of a relationship of what that looks like. And we all have different flavors for what that means. But we're going to go into prayer in this class, and we're going to talk about that right now, actually, the relationship of prayer. It's really an attitude of being grateful. That's what worshipfulness is. If we were to be thankful for every sensation that we had, everyone, that is an act of what we call grace. When we think of grace, it's divinity giving to us. And the word grace, we usually mean, saying the prayer or the blessing before we eat a meal. We say grace. But really, that's having the moment in the space of gratitude for what I'm receiving or about to receive. So every sensation, every situation, every moment, we can be thankful for. It helps to transform that impression in that moment. And in reality, the idea that God, big G God, which we in the Gnostic teachings, in the Kabbalistic framework, we say the absolute, which is the sum total of all creative potency, but is in and within everything. 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 And I find it very interesting and not practically applied easily, because this teaching is actually very simple, but it's not necessarily easy. That's the difficult part. But that this force, and in the Gnostic Christian tradition, we say Christ, but it's that light that is everything. In the Buddhist tradition, which we'll draw from a little bit later, it is Avalokiteshvara, which is a longer way to say it. In the East, also it's Krishna. But those traditions kind of lost their relationship to this impersonal, abstract, loving force of creation, so that it's become personified and we think of them as entities and entities alone. And that's one of the things that's happened throughout teachings, is this relationship that these entities exist outside of myself. But the reason they've become hailed as entities in creation is because they're entities in potential in every one of us. They relate to aspects of our own being. And esoterically, when one enters into a tradition, such as Tantric Buddhism or Sufism, these ideas around divinity that have images and symbols that one looks at and prays to, the one begins to understand, just like our awareness is divided, that what's outside of me is also inside of me. And so this abstract, all-loving, powerful, creative force that sounds a little cold, I prefer creator, which sounds a little exclusive for some people. So I said it that way first. This creative force that is everything, which means that if I reject anything, in essence, I'm rejecting everything. It's sort of a koan of understanding. And we speak about Jesus and his path as an initiate, not just as this holy individual that no one is like, because he represented something actualized that is in potential for all of us. That every point, even before he was born, he was met with hatred and disdain. And he transformed every moment till the very end of this terribly brutal demise with love. So that one of his last words was, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." And we should apply that to ourselves in every moment when I have a difficult situation. Not forgive them because they don't know what they're doing, but forgive me because I don't know what I'm doing. I don't see the divine in this. I don't see the beauty. And obviously, it's simple to say, but it's not an easy thing to do. It's terribly difficult, especially in the times that we live in. But as we said last week, the purpose of this creation from a Gnostic point of view is to awaken the consciousness, which means this place, this world, in the state that it is, was, and will be, is perfect because of duality and relativity for the potential of awakening our consciousness, which also means in a world of relativity and duality, it's perfect to fall profoundly asleep. The choice is ours. So it's not about fixing or making something better outside. It's about comprehending and awakening inside. And that the wonderful thing about that is, as a consequence, things outside will get better. And if nothing else, your perspective of them will get better. And that's where the salvation comes for each and every one of us. which is an awakened perception of the true nature of things, which all of the teachers have told us forever and ever, that we don't have the correct perception. We may use the right words, the right phrasing, but it has to come from the consciousness. That's where our salvation as a people, as a planet, and as individuals will come from. So we use the framework of the Kabbalah because it illustrates very beautifully all the different realms and dimensions. And as you'll see tonight, and as you may have seen from classes previous, one could talk about pretty much anything they want and relate it to the tree of life.
Because it's everything.
Because it's everything. But also, that being said, anything that we do say will be relatively wrong too. It'll be a perspective, because when we're talking about potential, when we make a decision or a choice or a statement, it in nature excludes every other thing in that moment. So why it's so important, as we're still aware of ourselves, to hold that always in that place. It's very easy to get hung up on a word, or as someone else says, it's a comma or a syllable. But in relation to one of his books that was being printed early in poor countries, working to get the books printed, said, "Master, there's so many mistakes, grammatical and punctual mistakes, punctuation mistakes in the books." And he says, "Don't worry, we'll leave that in there to confound the intellectuals." Something like that. It was I misquoted that. I blew it. It was, that was the idea. It's like, yeah,
let people who worry about that.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Because I would be guilty. Everyone would be guilty. You read something and go, "Oh, it's not very intelligent if they misspelled that word, or they, didn't put a period there, or, But let's take all that we can with the consciousness, because that's very important. Very important. Okay. I'm going to assume everybody can hear me, and we'll move on.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to ask for questions, but no, it's not yet. Okay. So, in relationship to awakening consciousness, we showed this glyph or version of this last week in relation to drawing forth the fire from the waters. And I want to add a little bit to it, because when we're talking about awakening consciousness, there are three elements that need to be balanced and in place. And we spoke about balance last week. And really, every class in some way is about balance. But there are three elements to the awakening of consciousness. And without thinking about it, I think we tend to think that awakening consciousness is one element. Like, I'm going to awaken my consciousness. And this is one of the beauties that the Gnostic teaching gives us. To fully awaken oneself, it does imply that birth element of receiving something new, experiencing, opening my mind to see and perceive and experience something new, superior dimensions, comprehending ideas, having wonderful inspirations. But in order for that to truly take place, there must be a relinquishing or a letting go of things that stand in the way of that. To me, when I heard that, and when I worked and came to a place of really understanding that that it's such a revolutionary idea. And the term that Master Samael uses is death, because it literally implies a disintegration or a destruction of something. And that's fundamental to understand that there are elements that cannot be, just like if you were to imagine that relationship of the magnets, there are elements by force that cannot be both at the same time. They cannot hold the same space at the same time. So something has to go. And generally, for us, it's our consciousness. It becomes submitted to, adjusted to, equilibrated by a condition. And so that this attraction that we talked about initially is conditioned into a particular set of circumstances and situations that are favorable for me. And if it produces favorable situations, I might think, wow, I'm conscious because I'm thinking about conscious things and I'm experiencing this moment and I'm feeling pleasure or joy as a relationship to that. And it feels like I'm concentrated, but actually what takes place often is I get identified with the situation and exclude all other circumstances because I'm focused on a word or a thought or a feeling or a sensation or an image or a memory. And I think even because it relates to something that I say is good, that I'm being awake, that I am awake. When often what happens is I just fuse myself and I forget myself. In order to be awake, I need to be aware of what I'm perceiving and myself as the perceiver. That is actually a high state of concentration in the meditative practice, when there's an awareness of what I'm perceiving and myself receiving this perception. Because that communicates, it allows, like we talked about in the beginning, a transmission between that element and myself. And it gets confused because we hear that in the end, we need to dissolve all of that and merge, become one with. But in the Gnostic ideal, we can't become one with until we become one. Because what happens is we bounce from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing, which is different from experiencing something and including myself. Including myself as the experiencer, and this thing emerges in my awareness, like a thought or something that I say, for instance, that makes you look away psychologically. Instead of looking away, with our consciousness, the objective is to include, to pull back. And notice every time that I receive something, I'm pulling back. And you see that very action facilitates an expansion of consciousness. But notice as it happens, we tend to fixate or put our attention there, and we actually diminish our consciousness. So when we notice this process taking place, that our attention gets pulled away, if we're working in a way that we are aware that something is this situation comes up and it pulls a memory or it pulls an emotion of anger or lust or excitement, it pulls something from me, and as it pulls from me, it takes my consciousness that's slightly conditioned by it away, which then means my consciousness has been diminished by that conditioning. So in order for my consciousness to stay engaged, open, expansive, that conditioning has to die. I know, in a PC world, that sounds kind of harsh. It sounds harsh. But as we practice and become aware of what our objective is to be conscious and to grow in relationship to the being, which is love and this attraction without diminishment, every time I diminish that relationship and say, thank you for this thing that I love so much, or unthank you for this thing that I hate so much, I'm actually separating myself from the being. Because the fourth element of that self-observation of 3 dimensions, subject, object, and location, is once we hold the space and include that prayerful attitude of gratitude. I always want to put those words together, but it sounds too clicky. Attitude of gratitude. So I say attitude of gratefulness, but no, I'm thinking attitude of gratitude. I don't want to sound like a self-help guru or some kind of catchphrase guy, but it's always there in my mind. If we have that attitude of gratefulness, that includes the aspect of remembering the being, which is the source of gratitude, which is grace. So that when we're saying grace or saying thank you for a situation, we're actually in communion with the being in that moment and remembering the presence of God. But when we reject or push away, or on the opposite, grasp, we separate and we create psychological constructs that separate us. We're still in the absolute, we're still in creation, we're still in relationship with the being, but we're no longer conscious of it. And that puts us in the lower world of Asya, which we talked about, and even more so in that process puts us deeper down inside. So it's necessary to continually think as we practice, I want to be new, I want to awaken, birth, which has more elements to just what we're talking about, but this is the beginning that we need to understand. Birth is always and will always be a relationship of creative energy. To be born, we need energy to create, that creates. But in the moment, we're utilizing the creative energy of the being to commune and communicate with the being. Because fundamentally, that is what the purpose of this creation is for. It's for God to know itself through you. That's our greatest potential. And when those moments where we're in a sunset or in a talk or a communication or an act of love or whatever, and we feel that satisfaction, which is more of a fulfillment, we know in that moment I was doing what I was meant to do, which in essence was to connect with the being. So with that, we start to feel that and understand that and notice when we're not doing that. Now, first, we're not feeling rapture. We're not feeling samadhi. We're not feeling bliss. But the purpose is not to feel something. We don't do this so I can get something, because we've already removed ourselves from the practice. We're doing it because at some level we know this is what I'm meant to do. And fundamentally, when we do a meditation practice and we have one moment of peace and relaxation, let that go into your emotional center as a reminder, I am doing exactly what I'm meant to do.
There's this.
Just to say this last word, because what Master Samael says, the reason of being for the being is being himself or being itself. So when I am being, I'm actually in union with the being. relative to my level of being or level of consciousness. So it's blissful in the moment, but we have to accustom our awareness, the relationship of death or the disintegration of the elements that keep us from awakening, is what is known as the third factor, which is sacrifice. Sacrifice is so important. And as we were discussing, it's one of the reasons why for a student, for an individual, for us as teachers as well, we are also students, we travel to retreats, is because there's an energy that's released when we sacrifice, when we make the effort to show up consistently for a class, for a group, when we've got just so many stories. It's not a big thing, but both of us, when we were young, traveled through LA traffic at the end of a long day 2 or 3 times a week to go to classes. And it was the beauty of a real sacrifice is you don't even realize that it's a sacrifice because you're doing for what you love. You're doing something you love. And in that, there's a sacrifice that has to be done. You have to bear with the difficulties. You bear with the level of the teacher that you have. That's often part of it. To receive the value of the teaching, because really what you're receiving is the values of the teaching itself that's being given through the circumstances and the sacrifice that teacher is setting up, or that the school is setting up. So we've had students that have traveled hours. We had one, and I told them that I was going to say it, so I'm not going to say who it was, but when we were set up, they actually traveled 5 hours to come to class once a week for years.
5 hours one way.
5 hours one way, yes.
Yeah.
Of course, they spent the night. I think they incorporated having friends and fun with other Gnostics, because it's hard to find Gnostics. But that for us is inspirational, because it lets us know that the hope and the want and the effort, and that individuals receive benefit from the sacrifice. When we sacrifice something for something we love, and it's not just us saying this, the teaching says it, it's the third factor. Being a missionary, being a teacher is a sacrifice. Being a student is a sacrifice. Contributing financially, contributing with your time, contributing with your trust, with your faith to carry out the practices, to sacrifice certain uncomfortabilities that you may have, or discrepancies in what's being said, because you know internally that this is beneficial for your soul, but you have to know that, or it's not really a sacrifice. Because many people can spend their life in service, but not really doing it consciously. And mechanical sacrifice, though everything in the world has its relationship, but conscious sacrifice, as someone else says, voluntary, conscious sacrifice and voluntary sufferings, or you can replace those and say conscious sufferings and voluntary sacrifice, which is giving of something for something greater, because you know it's for something greater. And that's the beauty, is then the sacrifice is not that great. It doesn't hurt. And that relates completely to the topic that we're going to talk about tonight in relation to this next world of the Tree of Life. So let's keep that in mind. I heard a talk once where a teacher said, particularly, in every moment, as we're doing this practice of self-awareness and concentration, having in the back of my mind, what can I see new? What can I give birth to? And what can I die to? And what can I sacrifice in each moment? That's profound. There's always something to be sacrificed. And when we do it consciously, we don't lose. So the question always comes up, well, am I doing it consciously? And the answer is, are you? That's for you to know. Because when you know, you know. So sacrifice is the greatest impetus to the work. That's why generally when you see Gnostics that seem more awake and you hear wonderful experiences, it's usually because they're teachers. And you think, oh, they're teachers because they're more awake, or they're more awake because they're teachers. And part of it is built upon the sacrifice that the teacher is giving of their time. That's why, that's what somebody else says, and it's part of the esoteric fundaments is that to charge for spirituality really is a crime. It should be done from love. And we do it from love and not from the point of, oh, I'm going to sacrifice because I know I'm going to get something better from it. Because one could think that way. Oh, you're teaching because, and I've even made a statement like that, but it's not what I really mean. It's that you could say, well, I'm doing this so I can receive. But the inverse is actually the truth. We have received, so we do this. And in that process, we're humbled because we realize we're not really capable of giving the weight and the power that this teaching really has, but we've touched it and it's touched us. And so we want to become a vehicle, an instrument of that. And throughout all time, this element of sacrifice was used. What we normally see in teachings, in books, and in the history is offerings, where the priests offer a sacrifice. And I think most of us, when we think of the word sacrifice, that's what we think of, right? It's let's get that animal, that bull, and put them up on the altar and sacrifice. But what we're finding in those teachings are usually a degenerated form, or meaning that once the consciousness and the level of the teaching is being diminished in some way, then an actual physical offering or sacrifice needs to be made to help balance that for the level of consciousness that we're not putting forth. And then it even goes one step further, and when the individuals and the humanity and the people are no longer capable of self-sacrifice or sacrificing of their desires, their selfishness, then it becomes human sacrifice or a sacrificing of someone else. And in reality, you can see when you go back into the very origins of what that is, that's what I'm doing when I'm standing in line at a store or I'm driving in the car, that I'm sacrificing everybody else for my benefit so that I can go faster, so that I can be first, so that I can accomplish what I need, because somewhere inside of myself, I feel more important. And even sometimes we do the inverse and we say, oh, no, please, you go ahead. But we have to know inside of ourselves, where's that thought and feeling coming from? Is it from a place of real humility, gratitude, or is it coming from a place of, let me sacrifice this for you? You know, I make the joke because this was a thing that happened and it just struck me so much. I know you guys, all of us, I think, but in colder, where weather's a little more intense, they have vestibules to restaurants, like the vestibule where you go in before you go in. And houses are like that too, but in the restaurants, are banks like that. I worked in a restaurant like that. Restaurants are like that. And it's always funny because you're walking up side by side with someone to get to that front door and you go, oh no, let me get that door for you. And you hold the door. And in the back of your mind, it's a little funny because, you know, as soon as they go through the door, now they're obligated to hold the next door for you. So you're right back in where you started. Now, genuinely, you're not thinking, oh, this is my way, right? But that's just the way it plays out. And duality, boom, boom, tit for tat. But it was funny, I was with my son once, and I was actually saying this as we were moving towards the door, and somebody else came up and he ran and grabbed the door, and I was going to say it, but I didn't. I was going to say, oh, now it means I have to hold the door open for him. And then as soon as we got in, he pushed past us and grabbed that door and held that door open. And you think, wow, how nice that person is. But you could feel there was a sense of good, nice, good people do this. This is what you should do. And shouldn't come into play when we're talking about consciousness. Being is what it is. So can we sacrifice? Can we sacrifice that? Can we allow someone to do something good for us? Can we allow somebody to move ahead of us? Another way to transform a moment when we're all guilty of driving and cutting someone off or doing something like that. And usually if we're late for work or late for somewhere, it makes perfect sense. I need to go fast. I need to get there, But when somebody cuts us off, do we ever think, wow, I wonder if that person's in a hurry. They probably really need to get to work. I'm going to let them go. We feel upset by that generally. Like, that guy's driving crazy. So another way to transform would be to sacrifice that sense of upset and say, I hope that person gets to where they're going. I hope everything's okay. Have you ever said that? I hope everything's okay with that person speeding. I hope they're all right. It's just an attitude that connects us in line with the being, with gratitude and consciousness. I feel like I haven't said anything yet, so I don't know if there'd be anything to question or pause, but we should probably pause for a moment. Maybe someone might have a question about that.
Not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Okay. Okay. So we'll start with looking at the four worlds that are, in essence, four trees of life imposed on each other, and which is why we can speak so much about a tree of life, because it has relationships in all the different elements. 1 second, let me see if I can get us to... The unfolding of this creation through these different worlds is an unfolding as if it's a pouring into and overflowing, which is why we say every sephira in itself is masculine and feminine, both giving and receiving. And from the top, the first world is the world of Absolute, and it relates to this first triangle here, which we'll speak about more next week. The world we'll speak about tonight primarily is this world of creation, which is the second tree that unfolds, and it relates to this second trimurti or triangle here. It's the world of Briah, where in the first realm, God, or this absolute cosmic force, acts directly. In the next world of Briah, God acts through the systems or the cosmos or the structures, and more esoterically through the archangels. The third world of manifestation is the world of formation, which in Hebrew is called Yetzirah, which is this third triangle or trimurti, where God acts through angels. And we have here messages, because the word angel means a messenger of God or a divine message. And in this realm, the messages come from above, but they also come from inside of us, which are also the messages from our own thoughts, memories, feelings, and the effects. This is called the world of formation, because this is where you and I are formed. We're formed by the information that we take in and process through our mind, that create concepts that we again believe, this is me. I believe this. I'm different because of this. Those ideas and concepts are the formation of who we are. How we feel and how we interact, the states of our consciousness are formative. And fundamentally, how we act, which is the third element here on this tree, which I'll show in just a moment. And then we began with the world of action, or the world of the material, where God now acts all the way through, directly through the systems, through the messages, and then through the matter of the material world that in us comes cosmically through the zodiac, through the stars, through the planets, through the chakras, and fundamentally our glands and organs. This is true, that God acts through us and to us and with us through the elements of our body. And we talked about that in the first room, and why we show this three-dimensional cube that has the three fundamental forces. We talked about the atom, but it's a relationship of the inversion of the divine Trinity in matter, in us, in the world of action. And that we really experience this three-dimensional world when we utilize our consciousness and perceive subject, object, location. And you'll notice at first it takes more effort to do this, but as you start to work this way and push yourself, you'll start to realize it produces a little more vibrancy. You have a little bit more resilience, a little bit more clarity, lucidity, and the objects become more alive. It's almost as if we're looking into a 3D movie, or one of those movies where they really enhance the colors. You get the sense of this really when you awaken consciousness in the astral plane for a moment. And if you really look, you'll start to notice that there is actually more complexity, more color, more vividness. And almost everybody, when they come back, they at some point go, wow, it's more real than here, than I thought reality was, in a way. But then we think, man, but it's a dream. But as we talked about, the higher we go in the dimensions, the more dimensions there are to an experience, the more truth it contains. When we bring it down to one thought, one idea, one side, we're actually limiting reality. And that's one of the very bizarre concepts that people, when they study Kabbalah, many start from this point of view of working with magic and using the energies of the tree of life, which is an infinite potential to create finite objects in their life. And just when I say that, you're like, wow, that doesn't make sense. But it's easier to try to do that than to live with an open mind and an open possibility and faith in the being to provide what we need.
Instead it's also really the same in a different way of becoming identified and taking what is really of the infinite, or of the being, the consciousness, and becoming fixated and identified in one point and losing our consciousness. Is to take the infinite and to make it so finite. And so those acts of desire-driven magic, desire-driven prayers are really the same in a different form. It's just identification. It's all identification, which is to take the infinite and make it finite.
And we could say, well, yeah, I need to make a beautiful world. I need to make a beautiful place. But until we have a real sense of beauty, which is the essence of Tiferet, the consciousness, the soul, no matter how beautiful I make something, if it's apart from the real creator, if it's apart from the being, it means that eventually I'm going to have to let go of that anyway. So Gnosis kind of gives what we call the straight path, or the path that is more direct to the being, even though it might feel less pretty or magical in that sense. Okay, so in the world of Asiya is the world of matter and action. We looked at the world of Yetzirah, where in the world of Asiya we have the three nervous systems, and the tree of life represents the physical body. In the world of formation, we have the organization of those elements, which is the intellectual center centered in the mind, the emotional center centered in the solar plexus that has a superior component, which we'll talk about here, in the heart, and the motor instinctive sexual center, which is triune. It's situated here in the abdomen, the base of the spine, and the top of the spine, the base of the skull, and in essence in the sexual organs. And we talked about that. So you can go back and listen to past classes to get an idea in relation to that. But in this realm, which is interesting, because I said this at the end of the last class, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but when we're talking about this world of Briah, which is the world above now, which is this element here, which is ruled by divine beings or archangels, and this world of Yetzirah, which is ruled by angels or messages of those beings, I said something very interesting, that not all angels are created equal, or not all angels are the same. And that may be an interesting statement, but there are two kinds of angels. There are created angels or generated angels, and there are self-generated angels. Angels that have created from inside themselves something new. Because all angels represent some form of intelligence that have a purpose. And if we're looking at the tree of life from the top down, as God unfolds and gives order to creation, and as we say in Gnosis, everything that's created has a mechanical component. Like we could look at the planets as they move, have a mechanicity and have a mathematical precise quality. But as we study Gnosis, we understand that those planets also have a divine intelligence. And in that, they have a conscious component. And so when we're looking at mechanical nature, if we see it as purely cold and empty of compassion, we're seeing only half of it. Or if we're looking at it and saying it's only alive and beautiful, as I said, nature's pretty tough. It's pretty gruesome. It's pretty harsh. It just depends your perspective. But it's in this creation, the angels represent elements of the divine that all have a purpose, so that every plant, every tree, every animal, every system, every structure has a form of governance. And so in that way, it can be a little cold. And that's from the ancient teachings, the relationship of the Gnostics was in relationship to this world being illusion and being run by what were called archons, or these dark angels. So I'd like to shed a little bit of light on this and to understand and draw from what we said and what we are now. Because we could go to a Kabbalah course and just study angels and superior dimensions. And hopefully up to this point, we've made it sort of practical and applicable. And so this is another aspect of that. So as we said, the key in working in Yetzirah is balancing the heart and the mind, balancing. And as we balance, we naturally move upward. And the real formation that takes place in this world of Yetzirah is what is known as the formation of the cubic stone, which is Yesod, or the foundation, which is this Sephirah right here, which is the crystallization. Yeah, but this is what's being viewed.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
Which is a combination of the formation of our thoughts, our feelings, and actions, or our creative sexual potency, to create an element that a temple is built on. So the first is the formation of this stone, because a temple, which symbolizes the human being, is a place to worship the divine. So when we have the attitude of gratefulness in our interactions, we're connecting and becoming a temple, a place to worship. The relationship of the stone and the water is very important, and we talked about that before. We can go much into that, but what I would prefer to get into is this next relationship of the world of Briah, is to take from that stone and to make an altar. And I intentionally have it subtle that this line is right on the altar, because it relates to the two aspects of the mental and emotional worlds, because each have a lower and a superior. And the superior mind and the superior emotion is directly related to this world of Briah. An altar, because an altar is a place to sacrifice a lower state for a higher state. When I'm engaged in my life, can I notice when I'm identified and choosing a lower state and sacrifice that, as if I'm putting it on the altar and lifting it up to this consciousness, and fundamentally to the being and the divine consciousness. Utilizing my human consciousness, which is this sphere here of Tiferet, to do the work, to consciously observe the mind, to observe my feelings and my state, and be aware of what I am doing and the impact that that has. That connects me to the superior world of Briah. And this is the access point of the superior world, and where the definition becomes clear. When we looked at the relationships of the angelic names in the Tree of Life, and the first is to become an Ishim, which is to awaken the fire in this physical body, and fundamentally do this work to awaken our consciousness, which we don't have time to go into completely in this talk, but to reach this level of Tiferet, which is to become a true human being with what's called mastery over the lower elements, or the material sensations as they process in the mind without forming concepts, in the heart without forming a representation that I like or dislike this, as I said, because that separates us from the infinite potential of God that is everything. And that I can feel sensations without losing myself, without losing my energy towards those things. That is fundamental, because that energy is necessary to form a new creation. Because here is where we find the difference between the angels that are descending from the Tree of Life and the angels that are ascending from Asiya back up. So when we're talking about climbing the Tree of Life, this is where the difference comes between what we call angels. There are angels that were created and fulfill a purpose. And as we said, as the Gnostics have referred to them as archangels, that in order for that to take place, in order for that crystallization of what in Briah are called archangels, an angel a being has to renounce or sacrifice what it has. And that's why sacrifice is so important. And even these superior realms, it has to do with a certain level of renunciation that angel has to renounce to its purpose. It has to renounce and sacrifice its bliss, to sacrifice its sufferless state, to descend and go through a process of development of a consciousness into human form. So the reason the archons were so critical of humans is just they don't perceive or understand the human nature. And it's as if you were to go to a zoo and look at, other creatures, reptiles or something like that. And just how we have pets and we move them around and put them in cages and do all sorts of things for their own good. That the archons are fulfilling their purpose to make sure that individuals aren't going crazy, that the world isn't falling apart. They're fulfilling their mission.
I think sometimes that often brings up, and in a time period of sort of lots of conspiracy theory roaming around, and I think with the instinctive center so riled up these days that it of course tends to trigger the intellectual center to try to figure things out rather than letting us rest in the vulnerability of intuition and living intuitively. The thinking mind tries to supersede that and make us feel like, I'm okay, I know what's going on. And so there's lots of digging into conspiracy theories these days. And so as I'm very aware of that, and then we start talking about archons and mentioning dark angels, I think sometimes that can bring up, hyper trigger that instinctive mind, the mind that has the instinctive center very tied to it. So maybe we want to say a little bit just to ease those sorts of thoughts that I think often come up when we start talking about these things, like, oh, there's other entities controlling us, and because there's lots of kind of cosmic conspiracy theories around this that are really missing the point, Right.
So, because the point for all of us is that we have the potential of God inside of us, every one of us, and that no thing outside of us, this is why this is so important, no thing outside of us can separate ourselves from that, from our ability to awaken our own consciousness. What can happen is we get identified and hypnotized and forget our potential, which is the state that we're in now. And that these angels, they're just angels that are fulfilling their role, keeping everything in place, which we have the ability of identifying or comprehending. And as we comprehend, we liberate ourselves from the mechanicity of reality. As we identify, we become subjected to and put under. Even if it's a car or a job, because often when we look at something, we don't think of anybody in this world. We think of what they have or what we want that we don't have. Rarely do we think of the sacrifice it took to make that, because everything that exists came about by some form of sacrifice. We don't think of, gosh, I bet that person had to work 12 hours a day for 10 years to have that money. We think, well, that's not fair that that person has that money. There was a sacrifice made that person made in the world of Asya. In the physical world, it's physical time and space. As we go up, the sacrifices are more psychological. And that the angels that want to ascend and to know more about creation than their role as it is, as the law states, in order to ascend, one has to descend. And so they have to sacrifice their angelic state to take on the form of a human being that's subject to death, that's subject to pain, that's frailties. The essence and the nature of every one of us is immortal, is infinite. But our potential gets restricted by our conditioning, and the eternal nature of our soul gets subject to conditioning of this physical body. So much so that we forget that we're eternal. And even if we think, oh yeah, I get it, we're eternal, we don't really act from a place of being eternal, because we get so fixed on this thing needing to be the way that we want it to be. And so in order to awaken consciousness in these superior dimensions, those superior beings need to let go and sacrifice the state that they have so that they can know more about the creation of life itself. And the Gnostic teachings, we go deeper into this relationship of how one becomes a human individual, and then the work with the awakening of the consciousness to become a machine, like we talked about last week, a real human being that then can become, in a future time, an archangel or a being that cultivates and crystallizes and synthesizes a divine attribute of God itself. Because the archangels in this image, it relates to light, because the first world of Atzilut, these three primary sephira, which we've shown in those three colors, are the three fundamental colors, where light becomes the blue of the Father, the yellow of the Son, and the red of the Holy Spirit. But then when that light passes through the next dimensions, we've said the law of three and the law of seven, that light then through Dot becomes disintegrated out into creation and becomes the seven colors of the rainbow. And that's why there's seven fundamental cosmic creators that rule an order, a solar system. It's not that the ancients truly believed that these planets or gods were something that they weren't. It's just that they understood that they, in addition to having mechanical force, they had consciousness. And that from the Gnostic tradition, these archangels that we talk about, the ones that we know generally and the ones that we speak about, that I think everybody knows the names of the main archangels. Such as Michael or Michael, which means likeness of God, Raphael, which means the health or the healing of God, Uriel, which is the fire or the light of God, fire of God, Gabriel is the strength of God. And we have heard in many of these traditions, and some traditions they have different names, but these beings, which is organizing the creative potential in this harmony of the octave, crystallizes into seven great virtues. Virtue coming from vir, which means virility or potency of the divine, or in its inverse, as we said, in this world, when we become identified, they become the seven capital sins or the seven vices. That those are psychological manifestations of these creative beings from the world of Briah, that have at their nature the core of one of these forces, like the force of Samael, which is the intelligence of the planetary influence of Mars, which Mars was a warrior, Aries was a warrior. It's a force of strength and courage and ferocious love. Zachariel means righteousness of God. Again, El is God. Oriphiel is light of God, and Raziel is the secrets of God. Metaton, which is a Greek name, which means the measure, the measurement, the size. It is related to a very large angel, but many of these angels from the Gnostic teachings we find actually incarnated and were beings in life, such as the angel Metaton, was the patriarch Enoch, who gave the teachings of Kabbalah. Down here at the very bottom in the world of Malkuth, Melchizedek is the intelligent principle that rules this earth. Now the point, we have to talk about this when we talk about the world of Briah, because if you study traditional Kabbalah, it speaks about these angels. But from the initiatic component, we have to illustrate that these are self-generated, meaning they were created initially from the absolute. They left and entered into creation, descended into human form, and did the work that we're talking about now, and more to it, and took from that cubic stone and created what is known as the philosophical stone, or a pure terrestrial body that incarnates the complete consciousness and potential and actualization. And that the angels that are ruling, or under them in the worlds below, don't comprehend them. Those angels are subject to these. And there's legions of angels that control everything to make sure that everything's in its place. And likewise, those angels don't understand you and I, because they've never been human. And there's many stories of, such as Francis of Assisi, continually being visited by angels, asking him questions. He had to shoo them away because they would interrupt his meditations. They wanted to know things. And without this understanding, we don't understand what that means. It's just that they don't understand the human experience. And in some time, they may choose in some future to take on a human form, but it's not that easy. It takes a great sacrifice to sacrifice their bliss, to enter into a world of potential and, let's be honest, actual suffering, the wheel of samsara. And so one story that helps us to understand this and illustrates it in a very beautiful way, where we're going to conclude tonight, is the story of Avalokiteshvara. Oh, I messed that up. But anyway, that
It still looks beautiful.
it looks beautiful, but you'll see, the Tara is down there at the bottom. She's not supposed to be there yet. But so I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Avalokiteshvara, but Avalokiteshvara was a great being that had attained the level to enter back into the absolute abstract space, or nirvana, but upon entering or approaching that realm, oh, I think I know why. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. Let's just leave it right there. Hold on, now I got it all out of whack.
Mm-hmm. Is audio okay? Still okay. Okay, good. All right.
Yes.
I know what's user error. It's not the archons, it's usually user error. I might have been tricked by them, but I made the choice to do it. Okay, so Avalokiteshvara was this great being that, as we know, is incarnated in the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. In Tibet, he's known as Chenrezig. But in Sanskrit, it's Avalokiteshvara. So this being attained enlightenment, and upon reaching nirvana, or on the precipice of leaving manifestation, he heard a cry, and he looked back and he remembered all of the beings in creation at all levels that not only weren't capable of touching absolute abstract space, continual perpetual bliss and happiness, they didn't even know that was possible. And in that, they didn't even care. And he loved, his compassion was so great that on thinking of those individuals, it said that Amitabha, which is the Buddha at the very top here, that relates to the divine being of the Pure Lands that's outside of creation, granted Avalokiteshvara 11 heads. And you see 3, 3, 3, 9, 10, 11 heads so that he could perceive all of the tears and all of the cries of the suffering humanity because he felt so strong. And then he was granted 1,000 arms, 1,000 hands, and each of the hands, as you see, has an eye in it so that he can aid or help humanity. And he was so moved by this moment of realizing that he has the ability to leave all of this behind for his self attainment of enlightenment, thinking of all of us left here, he looked back and he developed a tear, and that tear fell into the world and became the goddess Tara, which represents divine hope for us, Malkuth, the divine mother that gives us, and her color is green because it relates to hope, hope that all of us could attain that. But that wasn't enough. This love and compassion was so great, he chose to renounce or sacrifice his attainment of absolute happiness and joy, and vowed to not enter the absolute until every other human being returns with him. And from this came the lineage or the teachings of the Bodhisattva vow, the vow to sacrifice for humanity, which produced two paths. The first, the normal, was the spiral path, which was a path where monks lived and practiced in seclusion for their own self-realization so that they can achieve that and do it over lifetimes. Or the straight path, where the vow is taken of the Bodhisattva to return and work for humanity, for everybody else's awakening, not their own. And as we said before, it produces the conscious awakenings inside of ourselves as a consequence. But the effort was towards the other. And many traditions have this, be it the priesthood or in the Gnostic tradition, we have a bodhisattva vow, which is it's going through a monastery and becoming a missionary, where we sacrifice our life, relatively speaking. We don't sacrifice, like, forget our family and forget our kids, but we take the vow towards our being to help others to awaken, because we understand the grace and the beauty of what's possible in the little bit that we've touched. So from this, we have this wonderful mantra that comes from Avalokiteshvara, which is Om Mani Padme Hum, which we do a version of that in the Gnostic teachings, where we take the Om, well, the word Om is the sacred syllable. For us, it's the Christ, it's the vibration of all creation. Mani means jewel, which is the hidden potential of all matters to become a precious jewel. Padme means lotus, and Hum is the acclamation or the resolution of that path in one's heart. So the basic translation is Om, or we say the Christ, in the jewel and the lotus heart of our being. So because of the breakdown, we ran out of time, so I'm not going to really go back and look at how this relates to the Tree of Life, but this mantra is to be sung as a prayer. We could take a little break before we do the practice.
Maybe a brief
and we'll have to do the practice shortly. I intended it to be a little longer, but those darn every night to your Divine Mother, to strengthen hope and inspiration for humanity. So now we'll enter into a quick practice. Reciting this mantra, we begin to relax. And breathe in the way that we've been breathing. Inhalation, pause, exhalation, pause. Inhalation, with your awareness drawing the energy up the spine. Pause, relax. Exhalation, sending the energy to the heart. Continue breathing this way. And as we begin the recitation of this mantra, which is a variant, taking the syllable S and adding it to infuse it with fire, using your imagination as we're here in different parts of the world, praying, saying it from the heart, and allowing whoever or whatever comes to your mind to direct the prayer to them and incorporate that moment into your practice. Any person or place or situation comes to your mind, expand your awareness to include the prayer for them. And you'll find that you'll move through your day, through your memories, and you're praying for all. It's said that in the Tibetan tradition that this mantra is the essence of the Buddhist teachings. The essence of the teachings of the Buddha of compassion. I'll begin, and you can follow. And imagine that you're saying it with your heart, that we're not separated, because we're not. And that anyone that comes to your mind, anyone in the world is not separated, because they're not. But putting awareness and consciousness to this impacts you and them. Om Masi Padme Hum. 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 Om Masi continue breathing deeply. And when the breath exits into the heart, again, imagine it expands. Joyfully impacted, we receive this energy that we move through the body and allow it to radiate through and beyond us to touch every living being. When we're practicing not just for ourselves, but we're doing the most that we can do for this planet to elevate the vibration and the level of conscious love through us, through our sacrifice to practice, without expecting anything in return. Because in relation to all that we have spoken, we have to understand that the being, our being, your being, has made a supreme sacrifice so that you may have a physical existence. We have been given the greatest gift of all, that is life. And with it, the power to regenerate, to recreate, and to create life. And our prayers and our conclusion of the evening with our practice to the Divine Mother, which is an aspect of the being, wanting to know her, your purpose. Why am I here? What can I do? How can I do it? And in addition to looking for signs and symbols outside of us and dreams and experiences in our life and circumstances, let us commit to looking inside of us with consciousness and intuition. Let us conclude with the mantra Aum 3 times, sending and radiating through us to all the planet. So we thank you so much for your sacrifice to be here. And we're at the time, and we thank you for your sacrifice of accepting our technical difficulties. So this is where we're concluded. If you need to leave, that's fine. If you'd like to stay and have questions about the practice, about the Tree of Life, about
Archons. Yeah, but otherwise, thank you so much. And we'll have our next public meeting will be Saturday at 10 a.m. Pacific time for the continuation of our monthly Gnostic Kabbalah. We're soon entering into the influence of Gemini, so we'll talk about that on Saturday and do practices in relation to that to lean into that month. And otherwise, we'll hopefully see you next Thursday evening, same link, same time, and We're available for any questions.
For us, the real importance, and I know we kind of branched out, but not to get too out into the weeds of this, the real relationship to the archons, the real relationship to the demiurge from the ancient Gnostic teachings is to understand that microcosmic or macrocosmic event is unfolding inside of our psychology, and that we have created an element of our ego that rules us, and that the archons inside of us are the egos. And that's what the real key to that teaching is, that when we look back at the books of the Gnostic teachings that were found, they didn't have the masters and the disciples in a communication like this, communicating the esoteric reality and the psychological reality to what was going on. So it's just like, well, they think this and they think that. And even, so we're so grateful that we have a teaching and a master and masters in this teaching that are fulfilling and adding to the comprehension of what this reality and this path is, which you're not going to find in a book. You're not going to find it in a lecture. You have to find it inside yourself and in relationship to the teachings. So the real archons that we have to worry about are always the egos inside of ourselves. Because when we eliminate those, we cannot be controlled by anything outside of us.